Welcome to the SportsPro Podcast.
Hi everyone, and welcome once again to the SportsPro Podcast. My name is Eoin Connolly. I'm the editor-at-large at SportsPro. Hope you're all very well. Very glad to welcome back this time SportsPro senior contributor Matt Rogan. Hi Matt.
Hi, how you doing?
Not bad, Matt. Not bad. How are you?
Not too bad, thank you. A long weekend of recreational cricket. I think I've learnt to score. I've learnt to umpire. My brain is frazzled, and it's back to work.
Yeah, well, we'll see what the two teams involved think about the scoring and umpiring.
Less said about that, the better. Yeah.
Your confidence in that, but we are picking up, Matt, on the series that you started, brief series about how businesses can react to the COVID-19 pandemic and the unique challenges that have arisen. A couple of weeks ago, regular listeners will be aware that we looked at the 5 brilliant basics to help sport weather the COVID-19 storm. They were, just as a reminder, scenario planning in real time, supporting and challenging internal teams, showing less haste, more speed, and getting the tone of voice right, and staying visible by being relevant. And that was very much about just staying the course, really, in 2020 and getting through the very worst of this. Today, in part 2 of the series that we're calling Being Brave in a New World, we're looking at getting business ready for 2022 and beyond, Matt.
That's right. I think, as you rightly say, brilliant basics were a lot about weathering the storm and ideally trying to get just a little bit of breathing space, a little bit of time to think more broadly about what the opportunities and challenges might be for the business in the longer term, and therefore whether you're running a rights holder, an agency, a sponsoring brand, whatever, how you might reorientate your business to rebuild it with confidence, and remain flexible to whatever the future might throw at it.
Yeah, so Rebuilding with Confidence is the title of this second part, and it will be, there's an accompanying piece in SportsPro magazine and on sportspromedia.com as well to look out for. But the 5 steps in the process this time: look beyond the bubble for inspiration, understand where you fit in 2022 and build a plan to that, build a balance sheet against your new plan, not the other way around, explicitly move the goalposts and don't forget to say why. It's a good umpiring tip as well. And stay in permanent beta in the way you create value. So over the course of this podcast, Matt, we'll just kind of unpack some of those ideas and get a sense from you of where businesses can be looking in the long term. I mean, one of the things, of course, that was fundamental to what you were discussing before is, scenario planning in real time meant that we don't really know what the shape of the sports industry is going to be in 2022. But this is just kind of giving people the means to do a bit of longer term thinking and be ready for whatever eventuality they're holding in their minds at this point in time.
Yeah, that's right. And nobody said it was easy. There's a good article actually in Harvard Business Review this month where global managing partner at McKinsey, who's a guy called Kevin Smeaton, talks about what it's like for leaders at this point. Because, as you say, you got your head down trying to manage the scenario planning and things, really focused on the detail, probably as a leader, focused on a level of detail you haven't been for years in your organization. And you're sort of having to do that collectively with trying to get a bit of breathing space to look longer term. And the way he describes that is, he says, it's a bit like having a microscope to one eye and a telescope to another. And the only thing that's true about that is that that's going to give you a headache. And as a leader, it absolutely does, but it doesn't mean it's not important to do it. You just have to kind of take a couple of paracetamol along the way, I guess.
Yeah. But let's start with this first step. Look beyond the bubble for inspiration. I guess that the piece that you're mentioning is the fact that every organization or every industry is going through a broadly similar set of challenges, even though the specifics of it are going to create pressures in different areas. But I guess this is always a good tip, to be honest. But I guess now more than ever, if you've got your pandemic bingo cards at the ready for that one, but it's just good practice to try and get some sense of how other people are dealing with this.
Absolutely, and there's plenty of good stuff out there actually to try and learn a little bit about how other industries, particular industries that have things in common with sport, are starting to think things through. For example, I listened to a cracking podcast on the Tim Ferriss show with a gentleman called Nick Kokanos, who's runs a really high end restaurant group in North America called the Alinea Group, and he shares some fascinating insights in terms of how he's had to retool his restaurant chains for the short term and the midterm by starting to think about how he can build a super high end but also takeaway restaurant business. The other an industry level, the other one I'm spending a lot of time looking at the moment is fashion. It's interesting to have a look at the movement that's been set up across the fashion industry called rewiring fashion. So there's a lot of that's the hashtag rewiring fashion, which is really using the COVID pandemic as an opportunity to challenge a lot of the ways things have always been done in the fashion industry. And it made me smile looking at some of the things in particular the leaders of this movement have picked out as being unfit for the next 2 to 3 decades. So, fundamentally, the fashion calendar, the sell-in, sell-through periods and things just doesn't really work. It's too tight, there's too much in it. A lot of challenge of the fact that men's fashion weeks and women's fashion weeks might be different weeks. What's all that? Why would that be the case? A lot of challenge on fashion shows as a premise that you might get 100 people almost behind closed doors into small high-end venues and saying, well, look, we should reimagine fashion shows to put the consumer who's actually going to buy the clothes at the heart of it. And actually quite a lot of interesting tests gone on this summer. If you look at London Fashion Week and some of the digital communication that's gone out for some high-end brands, there's a lot changing that's fascinating very quickly in that space. And actually into some of the economics of it as well. Some of these retailers, unsurprisingly, trying to say, look, we realize now we need to break our addition to discounting. We need to start thinking more about the value we give to people who wear our clothes as opposed to the price we charge them, which is a kind of an interesting mindset shift. So I just think whether it's restaurants, whether it's retail, whether it's some of the things that maybe talk about later, the Metropolitan Opera in New York City have been up to, there's all sorts of interesting ideas out there. And it's so easy when we've got both eyes on the microscope just to keep focusing on what's going on in our little industry day in and day out. But there's heaps of good ideas out there if we can just take the time.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's interesting in this, as we've moved from the kind of shutdown phase into the limited reopening of the sports industry, is to compare some of the challenges that sport has with some of the ones that other industries have. The thing that I keep coming back to is, when there was no live sport, you saw sport has a problem with creating or having an archive anyway, or having a well maintained set of things it can go to that are packaged up and ready to go, to fill that non-live gap. But actually, it's been easier from a logistical point of view to start live sport up again than it has been to start live theatre or comedy or music, or even cinemas are a couple of months behind sport just because of the way that the kind of physical distancing gets arranged. And then you start looking at other industries and saying, oh, they have a problem with distribution, and maybe that's a strength that sport has. And they have a problem with live distribution, sorry, and maybe that's a strength that sport has. And it's being able to compare the whole economic set against other industries that's been quite interesting at this point.
I completely agree. I mean, the Metropolitan Opera is a really good example of an organisation that's actually said, we're just not sure that for us we can get any kind of viable product out. Not about economics, but just viable as an experience, just by having 500 people in our amazing venue in New York City. That's just not going to work. And so for them, they might have an amazing archive, but getting back to some kind of live is quite tough. In a way that for sport, we're already noticing, some of the sport going on in the United States last weekend, there are some things going back up and running that are outdoors, that are far more conducive. And whilst sport might have been hit early and hard by having to not having the archive readily available, as you say, it is back, and it is going to be an industry that other industries are looking to, saying, "I wonder how sport have managed to do it. What is sport doing well in that regard?" So, it swings and roundabouts, but there's still heaps we can learn from other spaces for sure.
Yeah, and having worked, obviously in the agency space, you're working with rights holders and with their partners, and you're
Mm-hmm.
connecting people and linking people to solutions and stuff. How much appetite and how much infrastructure is there to get these industries talking to each other?
What I think is really interesting is the appetite amongst rights holders now that I've never seen before, just to get out of that bubble. So, um, in a two circles world, one of the things since inception, organisations look to do is have insight from people outside of the sports industry who playing in similar spaces. So we've had Harvard Business Review speak, we've had economists, we had National Theatre, interestingly, we've had Zumba, and they were always fabulously well attended Chatham House Rule sessions. And I think also as more people from outside the sports industry do come into it in senior level roles, you're starting to notice a breaking down of the barriers that might have existed to gathering different insight. I think the reality of the sort of battle to reopen back up in the last sort of 2 to 3 months has been that it's sort of been every industry for itself. So you've got sport lobbying, you've got theatre and live events lobbying, you've got the airline industry, and the government's in this impossible situation around the world where they're having to choose between different industries. And actually, I think sport has done itself proud in that regard.
Okay. Second point, or the second of these 5 steps for rebuilding with confidence: understand where you fit in 2022 and build a plan to that. What are we talking about here? Obviously, we just to take it back a step, as part of the Brilliant Basics, the idea that you explored was just setting 2021 aside because it's going to be an unusual year. It's going to be a crowded calendar, and kind of restoring some of what was lost in 2020. So where does this point take us?
So I think what this is saying is, look, for all of us in our walks of life this year, we've had to be finance led. So if you go back to the Brilliant Basics, we're saying, cash has to drive the scenarios, and underneath that, cash drives the extent to which we can and can't put sport on under different scenarios. It drives the way in which we have to engage and support and challenge our teams, and so on and so forth. What we're saying now is that the mindset shift between Brilliant Basics and what we're talking about today is about rebuilding with confidence, rebuilding to what we can best see as a pragmatic future for our sport. And what that means is actually finance comes last. So if you look at some of what Nick Kokarnos, the gentleman I mentioned from the high-end retail restaurant group, was talking about, he was saying, his starting point is, well, actually, what are people going to want emotionally from a restaurant high-end cuisine experience in 2 years' time? What will it look like experience-wise? And only having solved those kind of questions do you get into a world of saying, well, what would that need to look like in terms of a business model to save 95% of the jobs we have and make money as a solid business, which is the way he described it. So it's very much, if Brilliant Basics is about generating breathing room by being finance led, this is much more holistic. And I talked to one organisation, so Craig Dews, who's chief exec of sports marketing agency called Limelight Sports, who specialise in participation experiences, and were quite unique actually in terms of having relaunched their strategy sort of 3 weeks or so ago. And Craig said, we wanted to do this completely in the round. We thought it was important to, especially with some of the transitions going on in participation sport right now. And we didn't just look at our brand identity and have a really simplistic sort of strategic look, but we looked at really why we exist as an organization. So what's our vision and mission? What's the approach we're going to use? What are we here for, really? And it was asking ourselves those kind of tough questions helped us, in particular through lockdown, sharpen the plan and test scenarios. So it was very much saying, okay, well, if we do have a little bit of breathing space now, actually, why are we here? What's the job we do? And therefore, how do we need to retool our balance sheet against that, as opposed to saying, well, how much cash have we got? And therefore, what can our strategic plan be? Which kind of brings you on to the next point, really, in terms of sports very good at being finance led. What we're saying here is actually we need to start with our reason for being, build out a strategic plan that works for our shareholders, our customers, and ultimately everyone who works in our organization. Having done that, then let's get into the nitty gritty of how we raise the money to make it work.
One of the things that a few people have returned to is this idea that, that the pandemic might not necessarily have changed anything, but it will accelerate certain things. So the changes that we're seeing it's not a new direction, but it might be, it might have brought certain things forward by a few years. And so obviously it will have accelerated some things more quickly because
Yeah.
they will have come about as a response to some of the conditions that we're having to live under at the moment.
I think that's right. I think great example of that actually was the SportsPro podcast last week with Malcolm Booth and the RNA, who was talking about some of their creative use of archive footage over the last couple of weeks, but also the way in which that's enabled them to think more strategically about their whole asset portfolio for the future. So it is a lot more future focused. So it is a lot more kind of developing a portfolio of assets that can be activated, in particular digitally, over 52 weeks of the year. And he really gave me the sense that actually, this was a transition that the partners who've been coming to him, or the incumbents, people like HSBC, have been looking for him for a couple of years. But this created the context for a nice to have becoming a must have through the course of this summer.
Mm.
So I thought it was a great example. I mean, his language, we're spending time now looking at a future focused asset portfolio, to me really rang true in terms of this second area of rebuilding with confidence, about understand what the future looks like and build your portfolio now against that.
Yeah, and I mean what we're talking about here is not just add-ons or updates to the way that things were being done. It's some of the really bigger picture things, top line things that you've heard people discuss with regards to entire business models, and the fact that you know organizations in sport might have to be more purpose oriented because their partners might need that from them as well, rather than just selling bundles of rights that give you access to an audience.
Absolutely right.
You're thinking, okay, well, what motivates that audience? What motivates our consumers? How do we bring those two things together?
Absolutely right. I mean, and so for the influencer series, I talked to the president of the Drone Racing League, Rachel Jacobson. She was talking about the fact that over the course of the last few months, they've been particularly active in terms of building out their STEM program, effectively a way of helping kids in schools up and down North America who might not have access to world-class STEM teaching, learn how to build a drone, but also embed the curriculum through the process of that. And that is a payback, of course, for brands wanting to be closer to a more social contribution, but also has a really good payback for Drone Racing League, because ultimately they've now got a fascinating pathway where they can get kids involved in building drones, at the same time get them involved in their digital simulator product that's available on Twitch for free, and then move them into the best of the best who built their own drones, then move them into competing on the live event platform around the world. So that strikes me as a really future facing business model, where the distinction between the core physical product and digital product and social contribution is just a moot point, really. It's just all one fused product, which from a brand perspective, I would imagine is particularly potent. It certainly impressed me when I talked to her.
Given the practical challenges that businesses are going through this year, and the financial challenges, and given the kind of the impetus there'll be, the kind of emotional pull to trying to get back to where people were in 2019, how difficult a step is this to implement culturally?
Well, it's difficult to implement culturally, but you need to know what you're trying to implement first.
Yeah,
I'd say it comes back to that Kevin Smeaton quote. Really, the microscope and telescope simultaneously do create a bit of a headache. He advocates, and let's remember that he works in with organisations who will have tens, if not hundreds of thousands of employees. He advocates having a specific team tasked with this. The more future-facing stuff, so you don't you don't sort of divert the day-to-day firefight that's going on from happening simultaneously. Whilst in our world that might be a little bit of a luxury. Um, I think what I've noticed in what charity I work with, but also some of the other people I've talked to, and certainly noticed at Two Circles as well. Actually it's quite nice for staff to just be released from the day-to-day firefight every so often, to think that there might be an opportunity to co-create a better future or a more sustainable future for their organizations, because everybody's thinking on the bus ride in, how long can we keep this firefight going, or what happens if there is a second wave and things like that. And so I actually think it's quite cathartic for staff to think this through. The thing I would say though is, you might have noticed what I said there was involve them in the decision making, and that's the key point. So you don't hire 200, 2,000, 200,000 bright people for 3 people to come up with a solution. Right. So it's about gathering views from different demographics in a workforce and things as to what the future might hold.
yeah,
People close to the coalface are going to be far better at working out what the future might hold for your sport than you are as chief exec. You might be better at the numbers, but they're going to be better at being close to the shop floor and thinking about how it might play through in the future. And so thinking through once a quarter, getting them together, even if it's virtually, or just creating a mechanic where they can feed ideas and innovations and things in, I think is well worth doing at this point. And it doesn't need to be too distracting. But I do recognise that to have somebody living and breathing this stuff 24/7, you might need a small team of some sort to play through in the next kind of year or so to really cement this. My time at MTV, we used to have a team that I ran called the Greenhouse. The idea was the Greenhouse team, which sounds grand, but actually it was 1.5 people. Was the greenhouse is a really nice analogy, because the greenhouse sort of protects young plants or new nascent ideas from the wind and rain, but also when the sun comes out, refracts the sun and helps things grow quickly. And whether you have a greenhouse that's 2 hours a week of your time as chief exec, however you do it, just freeing up a little bit of time to think without the stresses and strains of the day-to-day about what the future might hold and what that might mean for your business is important. Because as we'll come on to, I think otherwise you'll end up in a world where financiers, debt providers, and all this kind of stuff are going to be catching you on the hop. So you do need to be in a place of starting to think about what the future might hold.
yeah. And as you say, one of the ways that you make these kind of changes stick is that you make you build your organization around them financially, and your next point 3 is build a balance sheet against your new plan, not the other way around. What kind of steps are we talking about here?
So I think we're in a really interesting time at the moment, because you can't go on the SportsPro website any particular day without seeing a suggestion that there's a private equity provider talking to this organisation, or a debt provider talking to another, and sports in this strange space where, to some extent, it's back and happening around the world, albeit without crowds. And you have a longer term prognosis for the broader economy, which is fairly challenged. And you have a lot of funds, in particular private equity funds, who have um, pre-raised money, and a hypothesis there that sport, if it's struggling in the short term, might be a great source of long-term opportunity, rebound quicker than the rest of the economy, and actually be a source of some quite good deals right now. So what you're finding as a result is a lot of private equity providers and some debt providers knocking on a lot of doors in commercial sport, whether that's agencies, whether that's individual talent groups, whether that's rights holders. And my point here is that what you don't want to be is the organization that has its door knocked on without a concrete plan. So I think our experience at Two Circles, my experience in former lives, was that conversations of that ilk are more likely to result in deals that work for everyone if the invested party, or the party that will be interested in having investment, has its stuff together first. And what that means is that having built your plan as to where you fit in 2022, you've done the financial modeling, you understand where you're going and why, and that's the start point of your conversation, whether that's for debt, for equity, whatever it might be.
How is this exercise? How does this differ from the kind of the typical kind of management of balance sheets and the typical financial modeling that you might have over a 3 to 5 year period in normal times?
I think the biggest difference is what any financier is looking at in terms of sport now is it is the credibility of the management team to understand in detail the levers that are on their business for good and for bad, and have a realistic view of what the future might hold, and enough talent in the management team to navigate through it. George Pine at Bruin Sports Capital, for example, is a great example of, and his organisation of one that fundamentally invests in management teams more than it does financial opportunity, because they believe through the management team the finance will ultimately play through. We talked for the interview to a partner of an organisation called Liberty Corporate Finance, a guy called Tim Thomas, who actually were the team that helped the Two Circles management team set the right deal up from their perspective through the Two Circles Bruin transaction. And Tim's advice for management teams at this point would say, look, there's two things here. There's having your long-term business plan prepared before you have any conversations. So understand the key value drivers, what's going to make the difference in terms of the success of your business for the next 5 years. Understand in detail the upside and the downside, and be prepared to entertain different scenarios against that. And that, I think, is, Owen, to answer your question, is that's the biggest difference, which is you're looking for talented management teams who can navigate the ups and the downs of the next 3 years. And to Tim's point, the other thing he advised was due diligence at this point. So this is when an investor or a debt provider looks in detail at your business to say, is this robust enough, and is the opportunity as large as I believe it to be? That needs to be a two-way process. So there'll be, he believes, a continued interest in sport, continued availability of debt and equity into lines into sport, but it's really important for sport to ask great questions of those providers, because invariably the first call isn't the right call for sport.
Help us spread the word about the SportsPro Podcast. Subscribe, like and share our content on social. Join the conversation on Twitter with the hashtag SportsProPod. And if you're enjoying our work, why not leave us a rating and a nice review on your podcast platform of choice? And if you want to get in touch, you can send us an email, podcast@sportspromedia.com. The SportsPro Podcast. We're listening too.
You've looked as well at some other ways of generating a bit of capital. You know, one of them is we saw Lokomotiv Leipzig selling 100,000 tickets for an invisible match, and something that's a bit longer standing, which is that Chelsea have the Chelsea pitch owner scheme, where some of the fans hold a stake in the freehold at Stamford Bridge. If you're an organisation that's going to look to that kind of crowdfunding initiative, or open up a shareholding in the club in order to generate that little bit of income, what are some of the things that you have to consider in that respect? That it's, to make it something that not only generates meaningful revenues, but also or a meaningful bit of cash, but also gives people some value in exchange for that.
Well, you're right. I mean, this is an area of ownership that I believe personally is going to grow in significance. It in terms of its connective ability between sports teams in particular and fans, customers, supporters. And if you look at one of the ways in which the arts has survived so far through the course of the pandemic, it's done a really good job in this space. So Metropolitan Opera in New York, who I mentioned earlier on, to quantify it, they're about a $300 million business, employ full and part-time, contract perm, about 3,000 people. They've managed to generate about 300,000 new donors. That's not even equity owners, that's donors through the course of the summer, just by opening up the chance to have a more direct engagement with at a challenge time for the opera. And I do think, like the Leipzig example, I do think there's a large desire amongst fans, players, participants, call it what you like, of people in sport right now to help the things that they love through a challenge time. In some instances, that was exactly what happened at Chelsea pitch owners best part of 30 years ago when I became one. It was a case of helping Chelsea through a challenge time and owning its freehold. In some instances, it might be a case of saying, look, we want to continue our investment in this area of our sports. It is challenging to do so at the moment because we also need to pay the players, or we also need to make do on the new health and safety requirements. And so what we're going to do is offer up a small percentage of the shareholding of our club against a sum that comes in from fans. I wouldn't look at it necessarily as a means of generating material capital. And you certainly wouldn't want to go to the level, I wouldn't suggest, that the Bundesliga clubs have got themselves into, where actually they're finding that the level of fan ownership of clubs makes them a little less agile in terms of some of the decisions they want to be able to make at pace. But I absolutely think there's a role for collective ownership amongst the fan base of a club or a team in the future, in particular those local clubs and teams who are going to increasingly rely, smaller ones who are increasingly going to rely on better relationships with their local communities in order to thrive. I also think, by the way, that this part of the jigsaw plays through for agencies perhaps as well. Two Circles have done a lot in this regard through the partnership with Bruin and this kind of approach, which says, look, if there's a small percentage of our organisation which can be collectively owned, that's hugely powerful in a way that goes far beyond the monetary value of it. Then I think this is an area that's really going to grow over the course of the next 5 years in particular.
Picking up on the point about the Metropolitan Opera, this is going to affect some rights holders in sport more than others, but there's going to be a community of people involved with those organizations on a recurring or a regular basis who will be freelancers who are not getting paid or who might be falling through the gaps in terms of government support in some countries or what have you, or will in other ways just be disconnected from the usual environment in which they work. What are some of the things that those organizations can be exploring to protect those people at this point, or to at least maintain some kind of link to them?
I think if it's a case of working with people who have long-standing relationships with your organisation, in terms of building out future strategy and involving them in the planning process, and I realise that doesn't pay the mortgage in the short term, but treating them as much as you can as part of the broader family, I think is really important in terms of sort of their mental feeling, emotional feeling of connection as much as financial. From a financial perspective, I also think what you'll start to see is, in particular in the agency space and the rights holder space, developing more entrepreneurial relationships with sort of freelancers and associates of organisations. So, for example, to make that real, if I was building out my greenhouse, what I'd be looking for is people who can spend specific time on specific areas of my organization without impacting on the day-to-day operations, but also looking for real specialist people in that space. Then I'll absolutely consider going to the freelance space or the contractor space to do that. It was almost like as a bit of a think tank stroke ideas shop. And I guess the other thing that I think will happen as a result of this is typically what you tend to find in times of kind of economically challenged circumstances is a lot of new organizations and a lot of sort of innovative tech and things does start to launch up, because freelancers and people who don't have a committed long-term income stream so have to find other ways to try and generate one for themselves. And so I think we'll also see a swathe of really interesting, new, challenging business models emerge in the agency space in particular. I'm a big admirer of the team that created the kind of interim agency on furlough. Or it wasn't on furlough, was it not for long, in the UK, which is about a group of furloughed individuals coming together to try and do good through the build of a creative agency. And those people will have learned skills in the actual running of an agency they might not have had before. I have no insider knowledge, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if there's an organisation ends up being a kind of a legacy as a result of that come out the back end.
Just one more thing on this point. I mean, it's quite a big point, obviously, because it's how people are going to keep going into the future. But
For sure.
How do you weigh the benefits of an equity sale or some kind of equity investment against taking on debt at this point?
It's a great question. And I was thinking it's probably worth taking 2 steps back and just explaining slightly simplistically, but the difference between the two. So if you imagine you're looking at buying a new house, okay, if the debt route would be to say, okay, well, I'm pretty sure that I'm going to have a sustainable income. I'm pretty sure that interest rates are going to be broadly stable, so I'm going to get myself a mortgage. And effectively what that means is you're paying an interest rate every month, but you still own and ultimately own, when you pay the mortgage down, you own all of your house. So that would be the debt route. An equity route would be to say, okay, well, it's not cheap. I might struggle with the whole of the deposit. I'd also like to do some work on it and things. So rather than the debt route, and I'm not that sure about my kind of future earnings or the interest rates and things, I'm going to take advantage of my mate down the road who's just come into a fortune and has offered me $100,000 to be part of the deposit, and therefore own a part of the house. And the advantage of that is that you have to find less cash up front, and you have smaller mortgage payments going forward. The challenge with that is you never really own, or you never own all of your house. Maybe if you're putting an extension on, you need to consult your mate and things like that. So there's pros and cons with both. The biggest risks I can see going forward in terms of debt as an option is that even now, some of the interest rates I've heard quoted on inverted commas sort of safe bets going forward are probably about double what they were at the turn of the year. So just need to be very sure that kind of your foundational revenue streams and margins and things are going to be pretty consistent going forward to take on a large slug of debt. From an equity perspective, as I mentioned, I think it's fair to assume in the private equity market, at least, that there'll be continued interest and engagement in sport. And it's really understanding, if I could give one tip in that space, it's not enough just to say private equity is the right route for us going forward. You need to know what type of private equity. So are we looking for more of effectively a family fund or a family house investment that might have a 10 to 15 years worth of wanting to hold an asset before it gets rid of it again? Or are we looking to turn the organisation around in 3 to 4 years and looking for a private equity provider that takes a really short-term horizon? And that comes out of what your 22 business plan might be. The second thing that's really important is understanding how the private equity firms view their investments. Are they growth fund. So they're looking for sporting organisations who are going to grow the revenue line into a brand new market, and that's why how they're going to look to grow profit with you? Or are they saying, well, it's a pretty mature bit of the market, but if we grow modestly at the top line and then kind of shave costs left, right, and centre, we can grow profits markedly. And so all private equity, all equity routes aren't created equal, and it's just about understanding what is the right route for you. It's far too simplistic to say equity is a better option than debt right now, or debt is a better option than equity. Both have risks, and it's just really understanding kind of what the right option is for you based on what you think kind of your future world's going to look like in 2022 onwards.
Okay. Step 4 was explicitly move the goalposts and don't forget to say why. What do we mean by that, Matt?
Sure. So I think this is about once you understand where you're looking to take things in 2022, that will inevitably involve change. To your point, even if you can get sport back exactly as it was through the course of the end of this year, with the same number of fans, the same number of digital engagement, the same number of sponsors, the same broadcast contracts, it will still have changed fundamentally. And what's important at this time, I think, is understanding the permissions that come with this time and trying to use them appropriately, but to your advantage. One of the best organisations I've seen work in this space over the last couple of years has been the New York Islanders in North America. Talk about their return to play in 2021 back in Long Island, having been previously in Brooklyn, and just the communication that's gone around that, the clarity, saying we are literally moving the goalposts of our hockey team, and the clarity with which that's done, I think, even though that was pre-lockdown, absolutely speaks to the level of openness and candor that all sports organisations need today. I've been really impressed, and we actually talked for the article. We talked to the NLL, National Lacrosse League in North America, through the course of the whole of this lockdown process, who engaged their fans very actively in when the sport should come back. Ultimately, ended up cancelling the season as a result, and some of the public communication, in particular of their commissioner Nick Sakovic, has been excellent. It's not a press release cancellation. It's a YouTube interview, engaging directly with fans, tell them why and how the sport is reacting to everything that's going on. It's doing them on a regular basis. But interestingly, in that, he's also said, and as a result of doing that, I'll say now, we're going to relook at the way we structure our calendar in 2021. So, coming back to that example from fashion, it's saying, look, to the fans, look, these are some things we need to change, and our sport will need to fundamentally shift. And being very open and very early around some of the things that goalposts that might need to move for lacrosse too. So it's a little bit like we were saying in the Brilliant Basics in terms of just the candor and the openness with which sports have needed to operate through the short term, I think needs to permeate through the long term as well.
Yeah, and I mean that is the fundamental thing, isn't it? It is that transparency, because again, there's going to be a part of every audience that wants to take things back and wants to reconstruct and wants to get things to where they were before this crisis happened, and that's going to be within an organization, that's going to be within fan bases. Everyone's going to have their own things that they want to protect or their own agendas that they want to pursue. So I guess it comes down fundamentally to decisive leadership, but also transparency in how you conduct that conversation.
Absolutely, and sadly, this isn't actually an area where with the exception of some mainland European nations, where I think we can learn a lot from governmental communications short term, because whilst the decision making might have been logical, some of the communication in the UK and North America, I think in particular, has been quite poor. But I do think within the context of sport, it's absolutely about helping fans understand, in particular, the financial realities going on here. So, is it the same in England to have the FA Cup behind closed doors at Wembley? No. was the FA exemplary really in the clarity of its communication around why it needed to loosen people and the financial black hole it finds itself in right now? Yes, absolutely. And the more that we can come out of our financial ivory towers in sport and just explain with real clarity what some of the issues we have are, and make that real for people up and down the countries within which we operate, the better. Off the top of my head, if you've got a 300 million black hole in English football right now, and you've got 30 county associations to fund and support, that's going to create an impact. And so you have to explain that impact that everything's going to have at the grassroots as well as in the professional game.
Okay, last point. Stay in permanent beta in the way you create value.
Yeah, so I guess I've spent the last sort of 35, 40 minutes talking about building a rigorous plan and financial modeling and all this kind of stuff, and understanding where you fit in the market, managing your debt levels and all this kind of thing. And yet what I'm going to say at the end is yes, but stay fluid. And I absolutely realise the contradiction in that. At the same time, I think if there's one fundamental thing that we've seen in sport over the course of the last 6 months, is that things don't happen without partnership between broadcasters and clubs, between teams and players, between players and fans, between fans and sponsors. We're all part of a broader supply chain. And what I think we're seeing now is just a little bit more of an understanding from everybody that we need to let our barriers down a little bit and be fluid in terms of the roles we all play. Stay in that beta space at times, because you can invent some really interesting stuff if you do. So if you can leave yourself a little bit of space to do that. So I talked to commercial and marketing director Tim Hunt at Williams Racing, who was talking about their new approach to commercial partnerships, more of which is in the long film article, was saying, we're building partnerships to share risk in the work that we do and be accountable to our partners' bottom line. Look at Leicester Tigers, who a couple of weeks ago, the rugby team in England, who've launched a pop-up agency to support some of their club partners. You look in the mass participation space, now as Chris Robb we talked to for the articles, saying, you now got World Marathon Majors, Ironman, Spartan, and all the big guns talking to each other to navigate the next 3 years together, just like you got the fashion industry doing. You look at Formula One, sort of saying, okay, well, we can't offer physical hospitality, but actually we can offer an entertainment experience to far more people from our commercial partners if we create a Zoom type hospitality offer. They're all just examples of us letting our guard down, maybe being a little bit less precious in the industry, and trying to think a little bit more creatively about some ways which we all can create value, just like the Open did last week for some of their commercial partners as a result of their fantastic archive Open.
Yeah,
I did gather one fabulous example, which is about as extreme an example of beta as I could find, which is the London-based creative agency Dark Horses, who themselves decided that at this time to enter into the sports nutrition space with an energy bar. So they've said, well, actually, to be a creative agency, really good one for the next 5 years, we need to understand what it's like to be a brand.
Yeah.
Really understand, in particular, not our chief exec and our COO, but the whole organization to really live what it is to be a brand. So we're going to use this time and launch our own nutrition bar, gather some insight, work out where to focus it and go. And that's just a really interesting example. I think, you could argue it's a distraction, but I think in their case, it's really walking the walk and saying, if we want to be a proper creative agency in 2022 that can cope with some of the ups and downs that brands are going to face, we're going to need to be able to talk that story ourselves. And so I guess you could say it's staying in permanent beta. You could say it's just relax a little bit and keep a small amount of your greenhouse time that's just to test and iterate, even if it's just go jogging with a podcast from a different sector and just think once a week. Just give yourself a little bit of breathing time.
I mean, I might be misspeaking here, but I think the bar that the Dark Horses launched is one that they've been working on before lockdown. I mean, obviously, it would be quite difficult to kind of rush something like this out in a couple of months. But I guess what that's an indication of is that this kind of thinking was already in evidence, and it's maybe just going to percolate a little bit higher up or a little bit further out into the industry as we return from this.
That's absolutely right. I mean, if I think back to my MTV days and running that greenhouse operation, we used to have 50 ideas kind of percolating away. And the way we did it actually was we had every member of our team responsible for just nurturing one, and they had an hour a week just to tickle it along a little bit with a different idea, or just keep a working document of what they thought the opportunity might be. And then it just so happened that the right commercial partner or the right production TV idea came along, and boom, we were ready to go and plant it out in the main garden. And you're right, Dark Horses have been thinking about this. I think I first learnt about it at the end of last year. It just so happened lockdown created the conditions that enabled them to spend the time to have it ready to go. And that's, I guess, the attitude that I think we as leaders of businesses right now need to be having, which is, even though we're hunkering down and trying to weather the current storm, it's just giving ourselves, however we can and however we tend to work as individuals, just that little bit of breathing space, not to spend the whole time on the microscope, and as best we can, just get the telescope out now and again.
Home Run is the name of the bar, and it's
There you go.
a percentage from each bar sold is going to the campaign against living miserably, mental health charity. So Simon Dent has been on the podcast before, so I think it's nice to give him give people a bit of a nudge in their direction.
I can actually vouch for. So we talked to Simon for the article, and I thought I'd say thank you, and got a dose of the bars on Amazon, and I can vouch for the fact that when you don't know, you're not very good at concentrating for 3 hours, and therefore not a very good cricket umpire. They're pretty good at 10 overs to keep you on the straight and narrow and keep you concentrating.
Okay, well, there we go. We've got direct consumer feedback for you as well.
There you go.
What's the challenge going to be now for organisations going from that firefighting phase into what's going to be maybe a bit of a holding pattern in 21? Hopefully, at least for the luckier ones anyway, it'll be enough to keep them going through that year. How do you manage that transition now into setting up this 22 strategy and then executing it?
So I think ultimately, Brilliant Basics is about saying, right, where are we today? What are the most pragmatic 3 or 4 financial scenarios we can see over the course of the next 6 to 12 months? And how do we manage ourselves day to day, week to week against that? Rebuilding with confidence about saying, where can we see our organization and our market and our customer base and our shareholder base being in 2 to 3 years' time? And working back from that point, what does that mean we'll need to have finished by the end of 2021 to get ourselves in shape? And at some point, the working forward from the Brilliant Basics and the working back from the rebuilding with confidence collide. And that's probably the point where you can look at your 3 scenarios and go, you know what, we only need one now, because we know how sport's coming back in live format, in a format that we can sustainably deliver. We know we have the right balance sheet available to us to deliver it. We know our fans were with us. We've developed enough direct relationships that we can feel confident, even if our broadcast revenue goes down a little, we can make that back up with other media propositions. So you kind of have enough confidence that your Brilliant Basics 3 scenarios have gone down to 1. And that's the point at which I would suggest you're good to go in terms of kind of the be of the bang of the long-term plan. And that process of mitigating it, coming back against that McKinsey quote, that's going to give you a headache, right? And that's just the reality. And that's why hopefully podcasts like this and articles like I'm writing are somewhat helpful, at least to realize you're not alone in the dilemma, because I'm sort of saying things here that are completely conflicting. So I'm saying, well, your balance sheet needs are totally unique, but at the same time, you might benefit some collaboration. I'm kind of saying, stick to the basics, financial planning out, but I'm also saying, try and remodel for the future. I'm saying, you need to make tough choices, smart plan, focus, but also, if you come up with a nice idea for an energy bar, have a look at it. And that's the contradictions of leadership ultimately. And the job of any leader is just to manage the short term and the long term, follow your nose a little bit, and talk to other people who are in similar situations. I think one of the other things I'm noticing is the chief exec level in particular, those boundaries have come down a little bit. And I think for a chief exec in sports, call another one, just say, hey, I'm looking for some advice right now. I think I'd be amazed if you didn't get under some open diary time, just the time to chat, because we're all going through it.
We are indeed. Thanks very much for that, Matt.
Cheers.
Thank you to all of you for listening, and best of luck to anyone dealing with this particular set of challenges at this time. And we'll be back with you again very soon. Bye-bye.
The SportsPro podcast is published by SportsPro Media. The producer is Ed Dixon.